And today we want to discuss some of the effects of the revolution upon the American colonies. But before we do that, just so you can have these in your notes, and I think it's important to just know these dates. The Revolutionary War was from 1775 to 1783. We discussed the First Continental Congress, which only met for about 6 weeks. The Second Continental Congress met from May of 1775 through March of 1781, so almost 6 years. This was the functioning government in America until the Articles of Confederation were ratified by all the states. The key things that the Second Continental Congress did was to, one of the very first things they did in June of 1775 was they formed a standing army, as we talked about, with George Washington as the commander. A little over a year later, July of 1776, they did what? This should be standard knowledge. July 4, 1776.
Declared independent.
The Declaration of Independence signed. And also during that same time, the Continental Congress formed a committee to start working on Articles of Confederation. And that committee met for over a year, and finally in November of 1777, the Articles were adopted by the Congress, but then it took almost 4 years for all 13 states to ratify them. So in March of 1781, all the states had ratified the Articles, and therefore the Continental Congress dissolved. And the Articles of Confederation were, from that point on, our form of government until 1789. But even before 1781, what's interesting is that Congress made decisions based on the articles that they had adopted, but before the states had ratified. So that's an interesting thing to note. Let's talk about changes that came about because of the revolution. We want to consider this question. Can we see a social revolution in the American Revolution? Or was the American Revolution itself a social revolution? This morning we want to hit on 3 areas that were affected by the revolution. That's religious freedom, the institution of slavery, and the status of women in the colonies. Now, we live in this age of Me Too, and very tense race relations at times. Even though slavery has been outlawed for over about 150 years, it is still brought up in racial tensions that flare up in America. Religious freedom, not so much, although the There has been fear of religious freedom being infringed upon by some of these movements that have cropped up for, LBGQ2 rights, T rights. So when we look at these things, I know I didn't say that right. Anyway, when we look at these things, we're going to think, wow, that was really slow progress. And of course, compared to today, it's a lot slower. We live in an instant society where things happen very quickly, and even social and political societal changes happen quickly. So we've got to keep that in mind as we look at these three things. Let's talk briefly about religious freedom first, because it doesn't have as much to look at as the other two. You will recall that the 13 colonies, basically, several of them had set up religious tolerance. There was no official state religion. Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Connecticut, these are some examples. Or I'm sorry, not Connecticut. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island were the key to. Connecticut was more like Massachusetts in having a congregational state religion. Maryland was set up as a Catholic colony, although they did allow other religions. But before the Revolution, the main attitude of the colonists was we're going to tolerate each other in our religious beliefs. And this still allowed for some of the states to have an official state religion. Massachusetts, you may still had to have paid taxes to support the church. So toleration was more of the mindset. This was different from England, but still, it wasn't all the way to what Roger Williams had envisioned, a complete separation of church and state. The Revolution helped to change this attitude in the colonies from just simply being tolerant to expecting there to be protections for religious freedom, and to encode the principle that church and state should be completely separate. And what the founders meant by that was that the state, they would not impose religion on anybody, but rather the state would protect everybody's rights to believe according to their conscience. That is something that many people today miss out on. And there are groups that don't fully understand that the state is to protect people's conscience and their freedom to choose what they believe or do not believe. That doesn't mean that people who are American citizens cannot participate in government. It doesn't matter what religion you are, or if you're not a person of religion. If you're an American citizen, you can participate in government. The government cannot force anybody to believe a certain way, and they cannot set up a state religion. So that was a big change that came about because of the revolution. From mere tolerance to an expectation of state-protected rights, of freedom of religion, and church and state are completely separate. Any questions on that? Now, this is kind of a natural development because the majority of the founders were deists. That is, they believed in a higher power, but they believed that the higher power that was the creator basically created the universe and the earth and set it in motion, and that deity, that creator, was not involved in the affairs of man. Many of our founders were deists. There were several who were Christians, and such as Patrick Henry. And so it's not surprising that with many deists as our founders, they pushed for a separation of church and state. And even a good, solid Baptist by the name of Isaac Backus from Connecticut was one of the earliest staunch proponents of separation of church and state. So it's not like the deists outvoted the Christians. They agreed with religious freedom. And our country has really flourished because of that, as far as people enjoying religious freedom, people wanting to come to our nation so that they can be free to worship. James Madison, one of the key founders on the writing of the Bill of Rights, also being involved in his state government of Virginia, along with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Madison are probably the two most prominent founders who were staunch defenders of religious liberty, liberty of the conscience. Madison felt like religion was a private matter of the conscience. Here's how we can sum up the government's position toward religion. It was a position of benevolent neutrality. Government would be neutral, but there would be a benevolence to all people to believe how they are, how they feel they should in their conscience. Now, we know that there is a radical stream in a world religion today that believes that killing Jews and Christians and other infidels is a part of their religion. Does our Constitution and our Bill of Rights give people the freedom to practice that? No. The founders were more focused on what you could believe in, how how that played out in your actions was a whole different story. You could believe how you wanted to believe, but you couldn't break laws such as stealing, murdering, things of that nature. So the founding principle of religious liberty at its heart was what we could believe, and then what we would practice as a part of that belief, but those practices cannot break laws that would affect other members of society. Because we felt like in a democracy, in a republic, we could get along and live together under the rule of law. So we need to understand that distinction. Jefferson, during his presidency, had to, as commander-in-chief, he had to lead America to war against the Barbary pirates who were Muslims. So the freedom of religion is not that you can do what you want, but you can believe according to your conscience, and then your actions need to be within the rule of law. So if I had a Satanist living next to me here in Quinton, he couldn't come over and kill my cat for his ritual, because that's my cat, that's my property, that's my pet, and he's got to go find his own cat to do that, or go find a wild animal. All right, any questions on that? That would really make me sad if he did that to Sophie. Might lead to a religious war. All right. Let's talk about slavery and how it was affected by the Revolution. Who would like to share what is the obvious irony about the Revolutionary War occurring while slavery is a big part of the Southern society? What's the big irony?
They're demanding freedom while enslaving other people.
Right. Demanding liberty, freedom, fighting for it, while enslaving another race of people in the very colonies where we're fighting to have liberty. Now, the idea, the principle of emancipation, freeing the slaves, was not new after the Revolution. There had been strands of thinking even back to the colonial times in America. For example, a man by the name of Samuel Sewall in 1701 published a tract in which he stated that slavery was man stealing. So all the way back to 1701. And then by the 1740s, the Quakers of Pennsylvania and New York, they started to speak out against slavery on humanitarian grounds. If you think about Samuel Sewall and his tract in 1701, he was coming more from an economic standpoint, that you're stealing men and making them your property, and you're using them to make money. And it wasn't so much a moral argument, but the Quakers in the 1740s, they began to speak out against it on moral, humanitarian grounds. The Quakers started the first anti-slavery movement in 1775. So the same year that the revolution started, the Quakers had began an anti-slavery movement. In Virginia, which was a southern state with slavery, during the 1730s, they instituted a restriction on African American immigration because the African American population in Virginia was growing so much. So they restricted the immigration from other countries or the importation of slaves, but it wasn't on the principle of this is wrong. It was on the principle of if we get too many African Americans in here, there may be a slave uprising. So even though that's not an emancipation view, it is something that plants seeds in the minds of other colonists that if there's too many African Americans, it could lead to rebellion and we could lose control. Here's the big point about slavery before the revolution, and then we'll take a break. The movements that occurred before the revolution had very little influence on the colonies. Very little influence. So let's take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we will see how the revolution shook up the institution of slavery. So it's 10:13. We'll be back at 10:18. Okay, we're back. And during the break, I got to thinking that my example of the Satanist living next door to me and killing my cat might not have been the best example. Because I am an animal lover, and I am glad that we're having more laws against animal cruelty. So that example, and to show you my love for animals, here is me and my pet rabbit, Herbie, posing for a great portrait. All right, I think I told you about our cat Sophie getting in the other day with Herbie and things kind of going crazy. But anyway, maybe a better example would be if I had a Muslim neighbor and he was making a pilgrimage to his mosque, and he walked through my backyard, went through my fence and trespassed and without asking. So I don't know. So how did the revolution shake up the institution of slavery? Well, even during the revolution, you had, for example, in Massachusetts, they were allowing free African Americans, someone like a Crispus Attucks, they were allowing them to serve in their regiment during the war. We mentioned Lord Dunmore, the governor in Virginia, who made the Virginia planters nervous with his anti-slavery rhetoric. One of the things he did during the Revolution was he offered to give African Americans their freedom if they fought for the British. So what really occurred primarily after the Revolution was the collective consciousness of the colonists was changing, and that's especially in the northern colonies. For example, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1782. So that is during the end of the Revolutionary War. 1 year after the war ended, Connecticut and Rhode Island passed emancipation laws, 1784. 15 years later, New York followed suit, 1799. And then in 1804, New Jersey did the same thing. Eventually, all of the northern states abolished slavery, and that is important and that is encouraging because they're getting rid of this evil institution that enslaves human beings. But another important reason is why when it comes to American history. With the North having no slavery in the early 1800s, what is this going to lead to?
Civil War.
Civil War, yes. Why didn't the new national government abolish slavery completely? I mean, you had some problems like founding fathers who owned slaves on their plantations. And they were wrestling with the promotion of principles of liberty and also maintaining slaves. Then you had the Three-Fifths Compromise, which we'll talk about when we get to the Constitution on Thursday, where every African American in a colony counted as 3/5 of a person when it was determining how many representatives they had. But here was the out that the national government had about slavery as the North abolished slavery and the South continued to maintain it. They said, oh, that's a state's issue. We'll let each state deal with it. And when the Civil War rolls around in the 1860s, while slavery was the primary issue about state rights, the South really was seceding because they felt like the North was becoming too nationalistic, and the South wanted to protect state rights. So that's very important. Keep that in mind as we move towards that. But anyway, the revolution shook up the institution of slavery. Any questions before we look at how women were affected after the revolution? We haven't talked much about the life of women in the colonies. What do you think was the mindset as a whole before the revolution? Anybody have a guess at that? The mindset towards women. Well, they weren't looked upon like slaves as property, but the issue of liberty and the issue of slavery was an obvious, it was obvious in the society, but the subordination of women was not obvious. And that's because there was a belief, which we might call a two-sphere doctrine, that men functioned in the public domain and women were in the domestic domain. But even though there was this two spheres, public and domain, they weren't equal. Women were still to be subordinate to men. There was another belief that was prevalent, and that was an innate belief in female inferiority. The belief was that women were excluded from higher education because their sphere was, again, domestic, in the home. And there was also a belief that women could not reason like men. They were incapable of higher reasoning. The other part of that belief was physically, women were inferior. So this was the mindset of not just colonists, but Europeans before the revolution. But the Stamp Act in 1765, 10 years before the revolution, also did something to maybe plant a seed for the elevation or the beginning of the elevation of women. The Stamp Act, what it did was, remember, it was and this is a question that everyone has gotten wrong on the test. Everybody's been guessing the Stamp Act instead of the Sugar Act, so I'm probably going to toss that question out. The Sugar Act was the act that affected the merchants, but it was the Stamp Act that affected everybody. And so it affected the domestic sphere that women were involved in. Women were encouraged themselves, even in their homes, for the cause of liberty. And so women who were workers in the home and made clothes and, remember the Daughters of Liberty who rejected British clothing and made their own. They were using their sphere to be patriotic and promote liberty, starting with the Stamp Act. In 1775, there were some papers, or there were some articles in newspapers. Remember, there were many, many newspapers in the colonies, and that's how the colonists spread their ideas. Well, in 1775, several articles appeared that it wasn't found out until the 1790s that these articles were actually written by women. Everyone assumed up until then that they were written by men. Kind of like, what was the name of the person that Benjamin Franklin wrote as a kid that was in National Treasure? All those letters.
Will Good or something?
Yes, Silence Do Good. Yeah. So writing anonymously was not unknown in that time. Silence Do Good. That is cool. Anyway, so there were some seeds planted, but then after the Revolution, here's what developed. New Jersey, for a moment, they eventually changed it, but they, for a while, allowed women to vote. There was no gender specificity. Now, again, that was later revoked, but for a while, and of course it would be white female adults could vote. Also, after the Revolution, women began to publish more literature. There was a shift in education after the Revolution. One of the president's wives who was a big proponent for women was John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams. And then after the Revolution, there was this ideal that formed. The ideal woman in America was the Republican mother. And when we say Republican, we're not talking about the Republican Party today. But a Republican mother would have been a woman who was educated as far as citizenship was concerned. And she still operated in the domestic sphere, but she could have a great influence on her children. Also, after the Revolution, more women's groups or clubs sprang up, church groups, sewing groups, and they used the Democratic and Republican principles that were available to them. So again, when we look at it from in the time of Me Too and equality of the sexes in the workplace, this doesn't look like a major thing, but back then, when the mindset was men are in the public, women are in the home, and women are inferior intellectually and physically. These are some major strides. And they're the foundation for the continuing development of equality in America, not just for African Americans, but for other minorities and for women. And now today we see it in these groups that we would call special interest groups. It also crossed over into economics, where you had workers' unions form and to protect their rights from corporations keeping all the profits and not sharing more of it with the workers. So this idea of rights and equality starts to permeate all areas of American life. Any questions on that? Before was it Muldrow that was ready for the report?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Any questions, though, on those three developments? All right. So the bonus assignment was to visit an Oklahoma or report on it. It would have been good if you could have visited it. But you want to give a 3 to 4 minute report about the event that took place at this site or near it. So Muldrow, take it away.
Sequoia's Cabin is what we did our report over. It's in Salisal, and it's actually a place that we used to go for field trips. I know at Liberty, like the smaller schools we did,
Mm-hmm.
it was a lot of fun. And it's actually just like this one big room that you can go into, and it's a national literary landmark in 2006. So it's actually really cool just to have something like that so close to us. So.
Yeah. Why is it a national literary landmark?
Because Sequoia wrote the alphabet for the Cherokee, and so it was just a spoken language, and they didn't have any like writing skills at all or anything like that.
Awesome. Can anyone speak any would you say Cherokee?
OCO?
Yeah, we can say OCO.
What does that mean?
Hello.
Hello, all right.
Yeah. But he built his cabin in 1829, and it's a one-room cabin. He was born in Tennessee in 1778, and he actually moved towards Oklahoma and Arkansas before the Trail of Tears. So he was known as like an old settler of the Cherokees because he moved before the Trail of Tears.
Mm-hmm.
And then like he was a blacksmith and a silversmith. And one of his legs was like lame, but it didn't stop him. He was still very skilled.
Uh-huh.
And then at the beginning of like around 1809, he started to come up with the Cherokee alphabet. And he started to sound out the words that they said and used certain symbols for certain sounds, which created the alphabet. And then he finished with the alphabet in about 1820. And then him and his daughter demonstrated how they could communicate through written messages instead of just conversation. And this kept Cherokees in communication for years.
Awesome. You said you started writing that and coming up with it in 1809?
Yes.
The language?
Yes, he started coming up with the written language.
Awesome. All right. Anything else? Is that where he died? Is it north of Salisaw?
Yeah.
But there's also like a lot of things at his home. So when we used to go, you could dig up arrowheads all the time, or at least we thought they were. So there would always be like a Cherokee man sitting there, and he would help us find them. So it was really cool. There's like a lot of games that you can play too.
They have lots of activities.
Yeah, and you can walk
Carve
around and it's
arrowheads
like
and all that stuff.
murals around his house. So it's actually really cool.
Cool. So the Cherokee Nation was kind of headquartered, would include Sequoyah County after the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
So we have, very good, guys. Would you email me a copy of that?
Yes, sir.
So we have the Canadian River fairly close to here, and several people have told me that they used to go there all the time and dig up or find arrowheads. But I guess now it's a state law that you cannot keep arrowheads that you find. You cannot go looking for them. And I guess if you do find them, I guess you're supposed to give them to a state official because they consider it a state artifact. Have any of you ever heard of that? Now, I'm sure the ones at the cabin were maybe planted there by the people so kids could dig them up, but
Yeah, I think so, because we were all excited and they were just probably grinning at us like, not even true, but.
all right. Well, I'm going to share something with you guys if there's not another school that's got a report. This is not from an actual historical marker. I'm going to try to go and visit one soon and do a little videoing. And then I also want to video about this site that I'm going to talk about right now. Let me find something real quick here. Anybody have any questions about the test real quick? Or any of the assignments? Everything clear on Module 3?
When does the discussion need to be done by?
The discussion should be available.
Yeah, but when is it due?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. I think, is that the one that's confusing? Like, is there a date on the module and then a different day on the assignment?
I think the date that was on it was March 27th.
Okay, I've got it pulled up now, and let me, I'm going to pull it up for all of us to see. So your initial post is due March 24th. So not till after spring break. And then you're at least 3 replies by March 27th.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but you can always put your initial post before the 24th. And I think it's set up to where you have to post your initial post before you can read others. So keep that in mind. Anyway, I was going to get a map to show you, but Quinton, north of here is Eufaula Dam, Lake Eufaula Dam, about 15 miles. And then there's a little town called Enterprise, about 10 miles north of here. So during the Civil War, a I think his name was General Pike for the Confederates, or for the North. He came south of present-day Enterprise, and they camped out in between here and Quinton. And now, like I said, this is not a historical marker, but the reason I found out about this was some of the locals told me about it, people who have an interest in history. And what they shared with me that was so cool about the battlefield was there's some kind of tree that is not indigenous to Oklahoma. I think it's from Tennessee or Kentucky. And the reason it's now growing there is because the Confederate soldiers had coffee beans, or they had the beans of this tree, and someone gave me the 2 beans from one of the tree. Kind of look like milk duds. But because they drank coffee from these trees and discarded their seeds, these trees started growing in that part of Oklahoma. So I'm going to try to visit that site over spring break and be like some of those history hunters on the reality channels, you know. I've got an Indiana Jones hat and coat. I might wear that. Anyway, I know it's time to go. Let me quickly show you this. All right, can y'all see that there? Where it says historical markers?
Yeah.
So if you go to the Oklahoma Historical Society, they have a link to historical markers in the state. And so here are all the markers that are in Sequoyah County. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. So there's Sequoyah's home. So if you want to know about all the markers in your county, you can find it fairly easy. Now, Arcoma, I don't know why, because I know there are sites in LeFlore County, but they this website does not list any for LeFlore County, which is weird. So there's another website, travelok.com, and they have a site of historical places of interest, Civil War points of interest. And so I know like Backbone Mountain, Scullyville, Fort Coffee, these are areas in present-day LeFlore County. In Smithville, what county are you in? Is it LeFlore?
McCurtain.
Cherokee McCurtain?
McCurtain, yeah.
McCurtain. So McCurtain County has 32 historical markers. Chickasaw Trail of Tears between Broken Bow and Arkansas state line. So, you know, what's so cool is if we really look, history is all around us. I will put those links on the course homepage today. Any questions before we dismiss? All right. Have a great Tuesday and Wednesday, and look forward to seeing you Thursday morning.
See you later.
Okay. Bye.